Welcome to the Bridwell Institute for Economic Freedom's Texas Economic Forum. My name is Dean Stansel. I'm an economist and a research associate professor here at Bridwell. The Institute was founded in 2008 as the O'Neill Center for Global Markets and Freedom, and it was renamed in 2020 and upgraded to an institute in honor of the generous support of the Tucker Bridwell family, SMU alums, and longtime supporters of SMU and its Cox School of Business. The mission, however, never changed, and that is to foster the scholarly study and intellectual discussion of the nature, consequences, and causes of economic freedom in our local, state, national, and international communities. And we have essentially four ways we try to fulfill that mission. Number one, we do economic freedom indexes and related academic research to speak to the academic community. My colleague, our director, Robert Lawson, as well as my colleague, Ryan Murphy, are authors on a longstanding report called The Economic Freedom of the World, where they rank countries. There's an additional report on states called Economic Freedom of North America that I have been working on the last 12 years or so. And then I have a local version of that ranks U.S. metro areas as well. And over the years, our research and others, there have been over 1,000 articles published using these indexes in one way or another. And several times now, Bob and others have done kind of a literature review and found that a vast majority of those show economic freedom is correlated with good economic outcomes, and there have been a ton of diverse outcomes that people have used to measure good. But the second thing we do is public events like this one. So our most recent one before this was a conversation with the co-founder and former CEO of Whole Foods, John Mackey, who was also the author of Conscious Capitalism. Our third thing is reading groups. Each semester we have 60 students, some of whom are here, who meet weekly throughout the semester to read and discuss free enterprise economics, you know, the kind of stuff maybe they're not getting in the classroom in high volume.
Maybe not.
And since its founding in 2014, over 400 students have gone through the program. Each semester, we bring in one of the authors that they read that semester for a private presentation, and they get over an hour to pepper the author with questions. This year, we were able to convince John Mackey to not only speak on Friday in a public lecture, but to come in on Saturday morning and speak to the students as well. And students routinely tell us that they learn more from a semester in the reading group than they do in one of their classes. So take that as you wish. We're very grateful to the Armand Trout Foundation who for their generous funding of this incredible program. And fourth, we also work at education at the high school level. So we have a program called Teaching Free Enterprise. Some of you may not know that Texas state law requires all graduates to have a unit of free enterprise economics. And so Houston homebuilder Richard Weekley came forth 10 years ago or so with an idea that let's come up with a program where we can help these economics teachers impart the message that they need to impart. And so what we do is we provide classroom-ready curriculum units that they can just plug and play, and we throughout the summer we'll go around the state and make presentations to teachers, and in the 9-year existence of the program, it's reached nearly 12,000 teachers. So another great highlight of the Bridwell Institute. Without further ado, though, I'm going to move on to today's event. So these Texas Economic Forums are intentionally focused on issues that are of particular importance to Texans. And today we focus on housing affordability, what government policy does to make it worse, and how we can fix that. I'm going to give three very brief introductions for our three speakers. They're going to come up one at a time for about 10 minutes, and then at the end of that, they'll sit here. I'll ask them questions, and then you'll have a chance as well. So first, and hold your applause till the end, please, Nicole Nosek is the founder and chair of Texans for Reasonable Solutions. It's an Austin-based nonprofit dedicated to promoting affordable housing solution. She's got a lot of great ideas, in my opinion, for specific public policy reforms, and has had some success in getting those enacted in Austin. And so those of us in Dallas might want to listen. Second, our friend Cullum Clark is the director of the Bush Institute SMU Economic Growth Initiative and an adjunct professor of economics here at SMU. He just produced a new study yesterday, coincidentally, on housing policy that was released by the Bush Institute. So you can go to their website and find that. I'm sure he'll talk a lot about it today. And finally, our colleague Michael Cox is an executive in residence at the Bridwell Institute and the founding director of the O'Neill Center, our previous name, from 2008 to 2015. He was also the chief economist at the Dallas Fed for 25 years, and he's been working with data on the local economy for even longer than that. So we'll start out with Mike, who will give us some insight on the data, and then we'll go to Nicole and Cullum and take it from there. Thank you.
Okay. Can you hear me okay? All right, good. All right, so can we do anything about high housing prices? Well, are they high? Let's start with that. I'm here to bring you some facts, both cross-section and time series, to put in perspective how high Dallas housing prices are. When I say Dallas, I mean the DFW Metroplex, okay? Now, most of us have our memory of housing prices colored by what happened during COVID. The Dallas economy grew 17% in this 2.5-year period. And when it did, of course it did because we were economically free MSA, the most economically free MSA for MSAs over 2 million people. If folks moved here, the economy boomed, 17% growth, housing prices rose about 30% during that time period. It's true that they grew faster in Phoenix and faster in Miami, and those economies actually were stronger than ours, but we don't remember their experience. What we remember is ours. We do remember New York had a bad time, and so did California, with only 5 and 6% growth in their economy and a concomitant low housing price increase. But we remember our big boom, and so we say housing prices are high. Are they going to remain high? What's all this is going on? Well, housing prices did rise, but did you know also that median-sized homes are declining? Been declining for about 10 years. Median and average declining, both for homes listed for sale on the market and new homes being built on the decline. So we've seen Dallas has declined about 600 square feet, but we're still relatively high among the 15, say, largest MSAs. Still building relatively large homes and still have large home inventory, especially if you go up north to Frisco and Prosper and so on. Now, but where do we stand on median, the numerator, the denominator's size of the house? Well, dividing all that out, we are 6th from the bottom in terms of median square foot price. Black is the square foot price in 2016. The top of the blue bar is the same thing in the year 2025. So, well, that's March, February. And so you see the blue is the increase. So we had I'm going to look at in dollar terms because people spend dollars and cents. They don't spend percents. People like to look at the percent increases and compare percent increases, but that's deceiving. When you have a start from a low base, a small dollar increase can be a large percent increase. We had a $74 increase in per square foot prices here over this 9-year time period. However, that 57% increase is larger than in what we saw in San Diego, but they had in San Diego, then in San Francisco, but San Francisco had a $172 increase in prices per square foot. Look at New York's increase, $282, I believe. $280 is the increase in price per square foot in New York. So we still have very affordable price per square foot for houses around here. Dallas had to absorb about 1.2 million people growth over this roughly 9-10 year period. That's a lot of new homes to be built, a lot of people to accommodate. At the same time, Los Angeles shrank and Chicago shrank, and so did San Francisco and San Diego. Shrinking cities, fast-growing cities, Dallas and Houston. That's a huge rightward shift in the demand for some kind of housing. What did Dallas do about it? We built about 367,000 new single-family homes. Fewer apartments. We built relatively more single-family homes, Dallas and Houston. You can see those two black bars there, and then the height of the yellow bars. We are building more apartments and more homes than any other place in the country, but especially we're the single-family home king. And if you look at New York, how high the black bar is compared to the yellow bar. Look at Miami. Look at Boston. These are cities where they're accommodating the population growth mainly through building apartments. Why? Because it's expensive to buy a home there. At the top of the list here, we have cities that population is shrinking, yet they still have extremely high prices for their homes. And here we have Dallas, the #1 fastest growing city of all, yet our absolute increase, absolute dollar change in our price per square foot ranked 19th from the top down, 6th from the bottom. Our percentage increase was 17th, and we wound up being 6th from the bottom in terms of the price per square foot at the end of this whole period. So our housing industry did a great job of accommodating this increase in demand. So let's just pick up here. How can this be? How can it be with this huge increase in demand, our prices don't rise much, but with a shrinking population, prices are much higher and continue to rise much faster in places like, San Francisco and so on? Well, the answer is, at one place, here, you have relative freedom to build, but in another, LA, you have copious building and land use restrictions, zoning and other government obstructions, making construction extremely difficult and expensive. Now, I'm not saying everything is fine here. It's not. That's why we're here to talk about that. We can make it better, and we're going to get back to that later, but it's a lot better here than there in general, and we need this perspective. We need a proper perspective, and that's kind of what I'm trying to do here. Now, we're still building. Rick asked me the other day, are we still building? This is the 2024 data on building. Yes, we're still building. Dallas, Houston, multifamily, single-family building permits issued by MSA #1 and #2, and we're building relatively more single-family homes now than on average over the past decade, and that's 2024. First couple of months of this year, same trend continues. Houston has jumped ahead of us, but we're still building the most and building single-family homes. So back in 2016, Rick and I published something in DCEO magazine that showed that Dallas managed to avoid, over this 35-year period from 1980 to 2015, the home price buildup that happened in the rest of the country. Out of the 25 largest MSAs, we emerged with the fourth smallest increase in home prices over this time period. Well, it turns out we published this just before the house price increase started. It was like the calm before the storm. Just after that, re-indexing to the end of that data to a new beginning in middle of 2016, Dallas was 10th from the top in terms of the home price increase. And then if you take this forward to where I showed you in the middle of COVID, we were in the leaders of the pack with the fifth largest home price increase. So it looks like, putting it all together, where do we wind up after all this? So let's put all this data together now and go back and look at the 45-year price change index for Dallas from 1980 to 2025 and see where we are. See where we are. Here's where we are. We are in a group of 7 who are laggards, you might say, kind of near in the bottom of this group of 25, who we're not 4th anymore from the bottom, we're 7th, but there's a group of 7 cities that are experiencing relatively low home price inflation as compared to Boston, Seattle, New York, Los Angeles, San Francisco, and so on, Miami. We're just way ahead of us. So we're still a bargain. And I have one more thing else to say for perspective. We should all remember what's been going on with the general price level. The Fed increased the money supply 40% during COVID. Everybody needs to know this, because I don't like what the Fed has been doing. Having worked at the Fed 25 years, I'm completely disgusted with the Fed's behavior. The Fed increased the money supply 40%. Jeannie, how do you feel about it? She was one of my cohorts. Okay, And guess what happens? Milton Friedman says, inflation is everywhere and always a monetary phenomena, the result of too much money chasing too few goods. Well, the price level has risen 25% already as a result of that excess money creation. And that's your overall baseline price increase on average against which you have to compare everything else. My wife runs an insurance business. Look at insurance rates. They're up, but 25% of that is just everything has to deal with that 25% increase in the number of pieces of paper in the economy, money, relative to the amount of goods. And so that's, 25% of the inflation of home prices is just baked into the cake. A complete unnecessary thing that happened thanks to, Jerome Powell and friends. Okay? Our enemies, his friends.
You got it all in 1 or 2 minutes left.
So I'm finished. So, so inflation adjusting home prices for that price increase, what do you see? You see that Dallas is one of just a handful of cities for which actually home prices are falling now on an inflation adjusted basis. If you account for the inflation, Dallas home prices peaked about March of 2022 and have been coming down. Our home prices are not increasing as fast as inflation, but they've already returned to growing faster than inflation in Washington, New York, Los Angeles, Seattle. Everything you see here that's got an upward slope. 10 of these lines have returned to having an upward slope, which means the prices there of homes are growing faster than inflation. So, it's not what we don't know that gets us in trouble. It's what we know for sure that just ain't so, as Mark Twain said. So before we got started off for today, I wanted to kind of get what have we learned? What do we know? What can we say we know for sure? Well, things are a lot better here than you might have thought, yay. Yes, they can be even better. And we need to talk about how, of course, keep them that way. But for now, at least, this cross-section, comparing many cities, and time series, 45 years, analysis shows us that Dallas's housing market is still leading the nation, still kicking, and we all want to keep it that way, of course. Thank you.
So I'll tell you a little bit about what we're doing, and there we go. Okay, then I won't feel in your ears.
What? There we lost.
So I started out, please don't throw me under the room for saying, in a different city outside of Texas. And you might be able to guess where that is. But basically there, I was making just under $50,000 in my mid-20s. And despite working 45, 50 hours a week, I found that I wasn't spending 40, 50% rent. I was spending far more just on rent. And I was considered lucky in my friend group for being able to find a 3-bedroom apartment where one of the rooms there was a family and a young child. The second room was a young professional and technological, and me in the third room. I felt lucky that after paying the groceries and rent, if I had $1,000 consistent, this is somebody, working 65, 50 hours as a graduate, we call this graduate. So this led me to look at what was called land use in 2015. And I noticed that frequently, as the comptroller Hagar came out with a report, there was always a few people dropping more housing from coming online. And so, when we came to Texas, we noticed the same issue. Specifically, and Austin at the time was much worse. There's a few folks who kept blocking housing. And so when they tried to do a city rewrite, there was folks who kept talking about the reasons why you couldn't always, while there was a whole line of folks trying to line up and explain why we needed missing middle housing. Ultimately, that was sued. And so there's the big effort at the state, which we're seeing today, because housing is an economic issue. So I'm going to go over some of the polling and some of the policy proposals that we've seen enacted in states like Florida, and how it's worked in a massive way. So P Trust, this book is from T, and they did a deep dive on the different policy proposals and how they pulled here in Texas. So I'd like to point out, because I'll be coming back to this later in my proposal, allowing apartments near transit or job centers. About 75% of Texans support this. I wanted to give down to allow commercial buildings to be converted to houses. About 71% of Texans support this. And the highest right here requires simplified, faster permitting. This, maybe it doesn't seem so obvious, this is a huge reform that has really helped a lot of folks get into housing for cheaper. And I'll explain a little bit later presentation. That has support of 83%. So above 8 out of 10 Texans support these. What does this mean when I look at this P-Trust poll? It means that policy proposals like this are widely supported across Texas. Now we're going to take a look. This is in the DFW region. So this is our vote today. So we're talking about Cullum County. We're talking about Denton County. We're talking about Dallas County. Here's some of the proposals from a Texas Association of Business Foundation poll. This just came out in February this year. Texas Association of Business is one of the large coalition partners. Oh, shade, because as I said earlier, housing is an economic issue. I take a look at the state. Convert unused commercial buildings, 71% of support with affairs. Allowing 5 acres or more landowners to build to different levels of affordability. For the presentation, it didn't say the exact wording, but it's to different levels of affordability. About 7 out of 10 Dallas sites and Dallas-Fort Worth sites around this area support this. Allowing 20% of neighbors to block somebody's property rights. 76% of folks do not like this. I bring this up not to bore you with stats, but to show you that a lot of the policy proposals that have been tried in Florida, that have been tried in New Hampshire, not only bring on a massive amount of supply, but they are very well supported across Texas, but more importantly, across the DFW region. So this is a lot of the work that happened this last session. I know that there's a lot of text up there, so let me just kind of give you a synopsis.
Okay. Well, much better. So last session there was a push and we ended up getting a major bill passed. That was, let me go back here. That was HB 14. How many people may have heard about this? Wow, I'm really impressed. It's kind of one of those wonky policies. This is a law that said if a city takes longer than 45 days to get your permits back, you can go straight to a third party, an engineer, or accredited third-party inspector, somebody that the city has approved of beforehand. Some people might ask, how does this relate to housing affordability? There are a lot of reports that have come out in the last few years, one of which is from University of Texas, Austin. It showed every 3.5 months delay adds up to 5% to the final price tag. So ultimately, even though we might think, okay, it's really annoying, it's just a bureaucratic sloth, I'm waiting to get my permits back, in places like Austin, from the data that we've seen, it's 1 to 2 years to get your permits back. Places like Dallas, I've seen metrics from 5 to 6 weeks. All of that cost, time is money. And so there's been reports across the United States that have demonstrated that 25% of the price of a home is actually bureaucratic delays and the permitting process. We need to do better and get that down. So we have another policy proposal relating to that. In City of Austin, there was 2 proposals that we helped. One is allowing 3 homes by right on a property. The other one is reducing the minimum lot size. In City of Austin, initially, about a year ago, it was about 6,000 square foot, 5,750 square foot to be precise, and we reduced that to 1,800 square foot. This is drawing on a policy that was really successful in Houston, and I'll get to that in just a bit here. So this is one of the first policy proposals that the Lieutenant Governor has prioritized in a major way. He's spoken about this policy in a few public forums. He's spoken about this in interviews. Basically, what this policy does, and let me underline and bold this and put asterisks for some of you in the room, in new neighborhoods of 5 acres and more. So in new neighborhoods of 5 acres and more, you can now build properties of 1,400 square foot and above. What that means is that some of these minimum lot size requirements are somewhat arbitrary. In fact, there's an entire segregationist history behind them that goes back to the 1920s. Now, what we're trying to do is, if people are ultimately able to have less land, the price of the home goes down significantly. And I'll give you one example. When Houston enacted their minimum lot size proposal, they initially had 5,000 square foot that they mandated across Houston. This was in the late 90s. They ended up reducing it to 1,400 square foot. Pew Trust, along with a UT Austin professor, Dr. Jacob Wegman, took a look at how that changed the price of the home. What they found is that the new homes that were under 5,000 square foot were $310,000 in Houston. You compare that to the previous home that was 5,000 square foot or above, $545,000. That is a massive gap of who can afford a home after that policy proposal. So this is something that's currently a priority bill in the state legislature. It's passed the Senate, and the lieutenant governor has really championed this in a big way. This next one is actually pulled from Florida. DeSantis signed this bill. And this would now open up commercial land. So think about where your HEB is. Think about where your Trader Joe's is. Think about where the gas station is. That land in any typical city, if you take a look at Dallas, you take a look at Houston, it's about 20% of any given city is land. A lot of this land is still vacant. That is not the case with New York City. That is not the case with Los Angeles. So we have an opportunity, we have a huge need for homes. On the other hand, what we've found is between Amazon and between people no longer needing to go into the office because of different work trends, now people are working from home, there is not the same need for office space. So now we're finding that there's 2 bills right now that are traveling through the legislature on opening up commercial land and allowing office conversions by right. We've seen this done in Florida. In Florida, within 1 year of it being enacted, 15,000 units came online. Some people might ask, okay, well, how do units or supply relate to affordability? It has a massive impact. There was one study that actually came out, I think it was about 6 years ago, where they put a 200-unit apartment building up. And what they found is immediately after they put this 200-unit apartment building up, the surrounding rents went down by 6%. Because now, if you've got a market where you've got 10 people competing for 3 homes, you don't need to be an economist like my former presenter to know that the price of that unit or the price of the rent or the mortgage goes up massively when you've got just many people competing over a few homes. It becomes like musical chairs. So this other one it's based on this sunsetting concept that comes out of the Texas legislature. The Texas legislature, every so many years, they'll look at a department and they'll say, okay, are you guys, is this department actually serving its function anymore? We need an opportunity to take a look at the laws that are on the books. Some of these from the 1920s when Texas looked much, much different than it does today. And so there's a law that's currently traveling through the legislature that would allow the opportunity to bring things before city council, to have city council assess whether it makes sense that you can't by right build single family homes in commercial areas. So a lot of these laws that are still there, they don't make the sense that they did when they were enacted maybe 100 years ago. There's another concept called tyrant's veto. And this is a sort of an obscure law. This is one of the worst property rights laws that we've seen across the nation. And this is a law that basically says if 20% of the property owners decide that they don't want you to put up another plex on the side of their home, they can stop it. And then if you decide that you actually want that plex on the side of your home, you have to get 75% of city council to override that. Well, if you take a look, places like Oklahoma, places like North Carolina have either thrown this law out or they've made it more democratic, saying 50% of property owners around that area are now tasked. They still have the input. They still have the ability to say, look, we don't want that plex there. We don't want an accessory dwelling unit there, but it's more democratic. Imagine if we had 20% of legislators that were able to block legislation, or 20% of people that were able to determine presidents. Third-party review. This is a law that would basically, straight out of the gate, it's copying Arizona, it's copying Tennessee, and it's copying Florida. They've already done this, so we're somewhat behind the wagon. Straight out of the gate, we're finding that a lot of permitting offices are having a lot of delays. They're having staffing troubles. This gives the opportunity to make sure that safe engineers have the chance to be able to approve permits and make sure that permits are ready to go. This is expanding on the earlier HB 14 law that we spoke about. So, I run an advocacy organization. I have to always make my pitch for advocacy. We'd love for you all to get involved. Feel free to scan this, but we really need folks here to talk to their legislators. And we've got many actions, whether it's recording a video to send your legislator, or whether it's contacting our grassroots manager, Wes Benedict, to talk about different ways you can get involved. But the fact is, last session, we had a policy that was based on property rights. Property rights is essential to any flourishing society. This session, we do have policies that are based on property rights, but more importantly, we have made sure that those policy proposals are more outside of the neighborhoods and looking for opportunities to develop land that is in new areas, because we have a really unique opportunity here in Texas where 36% of Dallas, for example, is undeveloped. That's going to look very different in 10 years from now. So that 36% of land, we have the opportunity to open up missing middle housing for our firefighters, for our teachers, for our policemen, for young families, young students. Unsurprisingly, we've got a lot of college students who are helping us, because right now we are seeing the highest, and probably the economists who presented earlier would be able to echo this, we're seeing the highest age for home ownership that we've seen, at least from my studies, in 7 decades. 48% of young people between 18 to 28 are living with their parents, not because they love their parents, maybe they do, but because they have no other options. So all of these policies have been tried, proven in Houston, Florida, even some test examples within Dallas. It's time for us to do this on the larger scale. Thank you.
You can introduce me?
Thank you, Nicole. Thank you, Nicole. Cullum, you're up.
All right. I am Cullum Clark. I'm very honored to be with you, honored to be hosted by my friends at the Bridwell Institute. Thank you, Rick and Dean and Bob and the whole team. And let me say also hats off to my good friend Nicole for the great work she's doing in our state, last session, this session, and my friend Mike Cox for being a voice of reason in our community and our country for a great many years. Thank you for the great work you do. I am wearing my Mustang tie because I'm happy to report to all of you all that my oldest daughter just found out today she's going to be attending the professional MBA program here. So good to have another Mustang in the family. All right. So I work at the Bush Institute. I lead our economic policy work and teach also at SMU. And just today, as it happened, or I guess yesterday, Dean tells me, we released a report that has been kind of my life's work for quite a while, a report that we call Build Homes, Expand Opportunity. And we took this on because of the very strong conviction on my part that those two phrases are in fact joined at the hip, that underproduction of homes in our country and in a great many of our cities and resulting very high prices. All of this is, of course, a hardship for a lot of our most vulnerable residents, but it also is an actual obstacle to people pursuing opportunity in this country and bettering their lives in all kinds of ways. And I won't add a lot more on that, but maybe in our discussion if you all want to talk about that. But the subtitle of the report is Lessons from America's Fastest Growing Cities. And the idea here very simply is, I think the closer you look at any one city, you quickly realize, as Mike said, that it's very far from policy nirvana. In fact, sometimes people ask me, because I made a study of a lot of places, a lot of case studies, like, where are they doing it right? And the answer is, in no place are they anywhere remotely close to right. But in some places, they're a whole lot better than other places. So we have to be able to hold two thoughts in our mind at the same time. I think Mike said the very same thing at the end of his talk. We have to be able to hold in our minds, on the one hand, there are all kinds of problems in a Dallas. And on the other hand, it's still better than almost every place else. And that combination is kind of important to note. In the report, we do some national data. We're mostly digging into individual places. But what we say at the national level is, first of all, that home prices, on average, are about 20 to 30% higher than they would be in what I sort of model as a well-functioning housing market. We would not have nirvana on this earth. Housing would not be free. The money doesn't grow on trees. But it would be considerably cheaper if we allowed more homes to be built in more places in a fairly sensible way. There's a lot of range there. There are no shortage of metropolitan areas that are typically among our lower income metropolitan areas where home prices are kind of about where they ought to be in a well-functioning market. They're relatively free places by the standards of what the Bridwell Institute defines as economic freedom, but they're also not terribly wealthy places and not terribly high demand to live there. And they really aren't priced all that crazy. And then there's the extreme high cases. Mike already identified them. I agree on where they are. The worst are on the West Coast. They're probably about 60% higher than they would be in a well-functioning market. They'd still be more expensive than most other places because, nice place to live, wealthy, beautiful views, but they would be dramatically cheaper. We also come up with a number that America has underproduced by about 5 to 7 million housing units just since 2010. And that is a little higher than a lot of people estimate. But when they estimate these somewhat lower numbers, I think we do something a little bit different, which is that we recognize that people are going to keep moving across America towards opportunity, towards, chasing whatever is a better place to pursue the American dream, if you will. It's not going to stop. It has always gone on. And that means, well, if they're coming to Texas, then part of the actual demand that we have to fill is enough homes for the people moving in. And when they come from California or from the Northeast or something, they don't bring their home with them, right? We have to build more here, and it's not offset by a negative someplace else. What we do in this report is we come up with a set of scores for the 250 largest metropolitan areas in the United States, mostly focused on the 100 biggest, but we take it down a ways, and also a lot of individual municipalities. And what we're trying to do with these scores is we're trying to say, very similar to what Mike did, how easy is it to build there? So we can't just infer that high-priced places are hard to build. They might be really wealthy, attractive places. There's very, very high demand. New York actually is a bit of a surprise in the study. It doesn't come out as a great place to build, but it comes out as not terrible. It's a very wealthy place. It has a lot of merits to it, and the demand is, as we can pretty clearly show, pretty high. But it's still, as Mike's data showed, dramatically cheaper than Los Angeles, which is a poorer place than New York. That's a notable fact. The policy differences are actually kind of significant, even when you get into the deeply dysfunctional places. And also, they're quite different for the places that are functioning better. One thing we look at is what do outperformers do differently? Because it's easy to say, and I agree very much with my fellow panelists, make it easier to build housing of more types in more places. Of course, this should happen. What we also can say is, well, when places are outperforming, how did they make it easier to build more housing in more places? And here's the basic fact. Key takeaway from our report. Almost no place has done a great job of doing what a lot of kind of urbanists would love to see, which is dramatic increases in density in core built-up areas. It just hasn't happened anywhere. What has happened is we have seen tremendous differences across places in how well they can expand outwards, quite frankly. Are they expanding outwards into growing suburban areas smartly? Are they doing it in a way that allows, when you build out that extra highway or whatever, that more units get built because of that investment? And the places that have been expanding smartly are the places that have, in general, succeeded in adding a lot of homes, as Mike showed in his data. So one thing we also look at is, well, what factors predict who's going to have relatively growth-friendly building environments. One thing I'm really happy to note in this group in particular is my friend Dean Stansel with the Bridwell Institute is the principal author, you may or may not know, of a wonderful economic freedom of metropolitan areas data set over many years. I've been a vigorous user of that because it's fantastic data. And he just confirmed for me that it's a composite score that doesn't include data on how hard it is to build things. It includes a lot of other measures, and it's extremely predictive of the success in building more things. So different types of economic freedom all seem to be pretty correlated with each other, and I think that's a kind of a useful point. But there are a couple other things I'd also note. A lot of people would like to see dramatic increases in density, Brooklyn-type density in cities all over America. And I have no aesthetic, nothing to say for or against it on ideological grounds, aesthetic grounds, or anything else. But here's what I can say. Beyond a certain point, very high density in a city predicts extremely anti-growth policies with a really high predictability. It just seems that human beings past a certain point revolt. And they just won't allow, in a democratic system of government, electing their city council people, they just don't allow more to be built. And so that's a bit of a constraint that we human beings seem to have to live with. We also come out with a statistic in this report, kind of a headline statistic, that so we've identified 25 of the 100 biggest metropolitan areas, 25 that are just like Mike's list, 25 of the ones that are the most growth friendly. And we have the following estimate. Okay, you can ask about this if you all want to, but very simply, if every place else in America had policies like them, which is to say like Dallas, like Austin, like Houston, not nirvana, really far from nirvana. They haven't implemented all the policies Nicole has identified, and they should. But based on the status quo, if every place else had the same policies, we would have about 5.5 million more housing units in America today. Home prices on average would be about $100,000 less. Rents per month would be about $450 less. So the answers, we think very simply, are expand outwards, allow it to happen, expand outwards, but do it smartly in a way that allows a wide variety of housing types to get built in those expanding areas. If you expand outwards into what was formerly, agricultural land, but in a way that has huge minimum lot sizes, and you have, you build a bunch of infrastructure, but you get very little bang for the buck in terms of how many people live nearby, we will have a growing problem as far as the eye can see. We also have to get better at doing infill where it is possible in our built-up urban areas. The bills in the legislature are actually better on this than we ever have seen before, I would argue. Nicole may agree. We need to figure out how to allow innovation. I mean, just modular homes and manufactured homes, oftentimes these days, are indistinguishable in terms of what they look like from stick-built homes, and they're illegal in almost everywhere in our cities. 3D printed homes in Georgetown, Texas, outside Austin. There's an experiment that a company called Icon has done. It turned out that the price of the cost of manufacture, the cost of building, turned out to be even or so with a traditionally built house. And some people called that a big disappointment, like, oh, it turns out that's not going to pan out. This was the first experiment at scale anywhere. That technology is taking costs down by the month. I talked to the chairman of the company. He's very confident they can be at 20% cheaper, 30% cheaper within a handful of years, but you have to allow it. So policies. I endorse everything Nicole said. There's all kinds of things that ought to happen at local levels. I'm also a strong believer in the concept of local control. It's a great tradition in Texas. I think that entity that governs best is one that governs closest to the people. But the question does arise about higher levels of government. What should be their role? Nicole is very involved in state policy. To what degree shall states start overriding localities? And to me, it's a very tricky issue. It's something we need to wrestle with as Texans. The bad part is, well, when states start, more they override localities, you might like what you see, you might not like what you see, but one thing's for sure is, your local government is being told what to do by people far away. Do you like that or not like it? Maybe depends on the results. But I do think we have to recognize that there is what we would call a whole series of collective action problems, which is in a big growing suburban area like North Texas. Yeah, if each locality, let's say in any one locality, the people who live there are really happy with their, pretty big detached single-family homes on big lots, and they take the view, well, we do want to have like restaurants with people who work in the restaurant, it's like serving people and cooks and so forth, and we do actually want to have like jobs that we can get to without a monster commute, and there's a lot of things we do want to have, but we how about all those things are in the next town over and not in our bucolic little town, right? If every town thinks that way, we will underbuild everywhere. And so there is a question of coordinating better solutions at the state level. Let me say something really briefly about federal policy. Federal government subsidizes in lots of ways, okay? And as a general proposition, I'm in accord with my friends at the Bridwell Institute. I wish they would subsidize less, but they also can subsidize smarter. So let me just throw out a couple things before stopping. First of all, the federal government subsidizes supply in a lot of ways, the development of new housing. The single biggest thing it does is it subsidizes new income-restricted housing for lower-income people through the low-income housing tax credit. I wouldn't have a problem with getting rid of that program, but if we're going to have it, we could do it a lot more smartly. It's extremely inflexible in all kinds of ways, and the developers who try to use it can tell you all the many ways that it ought to be reformed if you actually want to get more bang for the buck there. Beyond that, supply subsidies, what else was I going to say? Oh, yeah. One thing to note is as we approach this idea of renewing the tax bill of 2017, you all will remember there's a program called the Opportunity Zone program. That is, in effect, a tax subsidy for investing in certain historically underinvested areas. Well, there was just a study from a think tank in DC called the Economic Innovation Group, and what it found is actually, you could argue, I did my own kind of calculations with the data that they presented, but you could argue that because of that program, which went into effect, I think, in 2018, that we have in those opportunity zones about 75,000 or so more housing units than we would otherwise have but for that. So it's going to be up for renewal. Seems like as subsidies go, it's been pretty useful. We also subsidize, I'll stop in just a moment. We also subsidize demand in lots of ways. At the lower income side, we subsidize it through something called the Section 8 Housing Choice Voucher Program. Very simple economics proposition. Here, I'll be an economics professor for a moment. If you throw subsidies at the demand for something, but the supply of that thing is very restricted and you can't actually expand the supply much, all you do is drive up the price. And we've seen a lot of that. But we also, I think, have to recognize as much as we subsidize housing for low-income people in ways that, frankly, are self-defeating by driving up the price, we also subsidize all kinds of housing for higher-income people. A simple proposition, the mortgage interest deduction. You can throw things at me if you want, and I'll try to run. But the mortgage interest deduction is, well, by definition, used by people who itemize deductions in their tax returns. It's overwhelmingly a relatively high-income crowd that benefits, and the evidence is overwhelming that it is capitalized into home prices. Home prices are more expensive because you can deduct the interest on it if you itemize your deductions. So essentially what it means is that higher income people can afford the same, they get the tax deduction so they can afford the same home they could before, but people who are lower income, middle class, don't itemize. Housing is more expensive because of that. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac also subsidize mortgages for things like second homes, investment properties, all kinds of things that are just unnecessary. Last thing I would say is we ought to reform these things, but for goodness sake, the federal government shouldn't do things that make it worse. Not long ago, the federal government under the last administration proposed a national rent control provision, which would have been a calamity. So start by not making it worse, reform those programs, and support localities that are trying to actually go in the right direction. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. That was great. I'm going to give you a couple questions for the panel, and then we'll open it up to a few questions at the end. Can y'all hear me okay? I don't... There it is. Okay. Hello. Whoa. All right, so I just want to ask you a question, the three of you, a question that's been puzzling me for a couple of years now. And as someone who lived in Florida at the time of the last real estate collapse, it always seemed puzzling to me that Dallas and Texas in general didn't have that same run-up in prices and therefore didn't have that same collapse that some people maybe are worried about happening again. But this time, Dallas, Texas has seen this huge run-up in prices. And maybe there's a policy answer, something has changed since the last real estate crisis, but I legitimately don't know the answer, and I'm really just kind of curious. Go
I can try it that one real fast, because I did look at this, and can you all hear me? Because I still have this last thing on. So I think that the run-up in prices that happened in some, but not all, cities of the United States prior to the crash of 2008 was totally different than the run-up in prices that got going in the early 2010s and have continued in the following respect. Here's a very simple proposition. One thing you can look at is our home prices and the overall cost of home ownership, which of course also moves with interest rates, is the cost of home ownership more or less moving with rents, or not? There's a really simple, that may be oversimplifying things, but you could say, well, if rents are moving up really strongly, then, it kind of looks like the supply and demand for housing is actually changing in what I would call an adverse way. What we saw and what we've actually seen in this most recent period, really the last decade plus, is they've moved. There are exceptions to this, but on the whole, they've kind of moved up together, and then they sort of, with the big interest rate increases, kind of stabilized together. Totally different before the crash of '08. Then home prices completely detached from rents, particularly in a relatively small number of places. The evidence, I think, is really strong that what you had was a classic speculative bubble. And who can say why human beings get totally excited with some shiny object and want to chase things in a classic speculative bubble like Japanese equities in the late 80s or something like that. But I think it just turned out that condos in Miami were a red-hot speculative thing, as were condos and homes in Las Vegas. But homes in actually most of the country, Texas and most of the rest of the middle of the country, weren't actually particularly a hot speculative item.
I'd love to just add something. Sure. I agree with everything that Dr. Clark said. Man, the microphones really don't like me. Oh, here we go. There's an interesting study that I think piggybacks onto what he was saying. And it was a study that I looked at that showed that in moderately regulated markets versus overly regulated markets, what they found was that there's 40% more supply that comes online, and then 20% inflation, 20% less inflation when you take a look at a moderately versus overly regulated market. Which tells me, similar to what Dr. Clark is saying, is that in places like maybe San Francisco or LA, where there's more of an inflated market, you don't have a regulatory market. Whoa, there we go. A regulatory market that's able to accommodate to the demand as quickly. So then, similar to the musical chairs example, you've got 10 people that are competing over 3 homes. Those 3 homes go up in price, and off you go. So.
Okay, so we have time for a few questions from the audience, if you wish. There are 2 microphones that you can come up. Please make it a question and be brief, not a statement. Thank you.
This is more question is more, well, not a question, that comment question, whatever. It's more for Nicole. The idea of repurposing commercial building is a great one. I've been talking to friends, about that idea. I'm not a developer, but based on my experience growing up in Hong Kong back in the 60s and 50s, and I'm not that old, but I'm just trying to recall from that period how the government is handling this, housing crisis. Of course, it's a different government. It's a colonial government, but providing low-cost housing is pretty much the same, and affordable housing. So I guess what I'm trying to say is changing the politicians' mindset into reconverting this commercial building. Is that something that you guys can look at from the colonial period policy and how they're doing it, and then borrow it?
I actually need to learn from you about what the colonial period and I'm very fascinated by your experience, but what I could tell you is that even with other issues, and here's what I think is so beautiful about this topic in particular, we have, when talking to politicians and elected officials, housing is not just a housing issue. As you heard earlier, it's a wage issue. It's a jobs issue. You take a look at Hoover Institute, the top 5 reasons that startups and companies moved away from California to Florida and Texas, one of the top ones was cost of living. That's housing. Because suddenly if somebody's skill set is actually worth $75,000, now a company has to pay them $90,000 to subsidize the inability of cities' inability to build more. So I think this is really important. And when we talk to elected officials, we bring that up. Elected officials like to say, hey, I brought this many jobs to my area. But then when you have places like Placer Refinery, who moved right outside of Dallas, they moved right outside of Dallas, brought many jobs, and then they up and moved shortly after, citing the high housing costs, and they moved to Mississippi. That's a problem. I'll add one more thing because I don't want to overtalk here. It's housing, fascinatingly so, has become also a farm and an agricultural issue, and that's a huge compelling reason when you're talking to rural Texans and rural elected officials. The Farm Bureau has come out in strong support of what we're doing because 25% of Texas is nationally significant land. We've got about $25 billion of agricultural exports, and there was a direct study from the American Farmland Trust before we even got started that showed that when you have huge lot sizes, it pushes people out to deteriorate that valuable farmland. So as Cody Vasut, who's a representative, who's also a rural member, said in the Texas legislature, and I'm summarizing here, let rural cities be rural and let cities be cities.
So during Ms. Nosek's presentation, you used a term that I'm familiar with, but other people here may not be familiar with, and other terms that we may not be familiar with. So I'm looking for a little bit of a definition. And I know in Dallas we have zoning, which tells what you can and cannot do with a piece of property unless you get the city to say otherwise. And in Houston, you have very little zoning, if none. In Austin, I'm not familiar with. But you used a term called by right. To me, I think that means a developer has by right to do anything he wants to with a piece of property, regardless of what the zoning is. So I want you to
Clarify that.
And I got two more questions, and then I can sit down and you all can go at it. The other question is, what do you define as middle market housing? Middle market housing. Okay, I think you used that term. And the third question I have, which all kind of goes together, is what is your definition of affordable housing?
We don't have time for three, but can you jump on that last one or pick if you want to?
Yeah.
I think she used by right only a lot, and it's very important. There's legislation before the state legislature that's going to allow a lot of development by right against all cities' current rights.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
So you bring up a great point. By right, it actually, I think it has different meanings in different cities. Now, if you take a look at the laws that are before the state legislature, we make sure that when it comes to fire, when it comes to floodplains, when it comes to other safety provisions, that there's a checklist that must be checked. Even highly regulated states like California have some policies that are by right. So this by right, in some areas where they don't have safety provisions that are included in the checklist, that could technically be by right, but the ones that we are looking at for by right have safety provisions, they have fire, they have floodplain protections built in. So it does not mean that a developer up and just starts building. It means they go into, whether it's a third party or they go into the city permitting office and they say, I've got this checklist met, and so I can start, and then they start the process to start building. So yes, I see your concern, sir. We do have that. I'll just say this really quick on the missing middle element. When one of the policies that we looked at is based off of Florida's Live Local Act, which has brought on 15,000 units, and they seem to define that middle market as between 80 to 120% median family income. So think about 80 to 120%. I'll add just one last thing here. You take a look at places like Dallas. You take a look at places like Los Angeles. I actually did an op-ed that we published in the DMN with an economist, where we took a look when you allow missing middle housing to come online, you are allowing more low-income people to stay here. Because what you've seen in markets like San Francisco is what should have been naturally occurring affordable housing, you suddenly have a high-income individual that's going in, renovating that to be a luxury apartment or a luxury house when you have a deficit of houses. So missing middle housing, because of the filtering concept, does turn into more low-income housing. I'm sorry I took up all the time here, so sorry,
No
guys.
problem. All right, so it wouldn't be a Bridwell event in 2025 if we didn't say something about tariffs. So I'm going to give my esteemed colleague, Michael Cox, a chance to make a very brief statement about tariffs related to housing. Thank you, Mike.
You know, there's something we're really overlooking here. The title of this presentation is "What Can We Do About High Housing Prices?" Well, we're doing the opposite right now about housing prices, affordability with these tariffs. Think about the way a house is made. It's full of lumber, which comes from Canada. It's got appliances in it nowadays. We outfit these houses with dishwashers and all other kinds of appliances which come from either Korea or from China. We build the rug. They have rugs in them that come from China. The walls are painted that comes from some foreign country. And we're tariffing every one of these things with 50 to 100% tariffs, which are going to drive up the prices that builders have to pay to. You see what I'm going? Every one of these housing prices are going to zoom upward across the nation because of these tariffs.
And everybody knows it's temporary.
Temporary. Yes.
Thank you, Mike. And one other factor, the deportation of immigrants is also going to impact housing costs because it restricts the supply of construction labor. So
Exactly.
it gets worse. But we're out of time. I'm so sorry. Thank you for coming out. Thank you for all your great questions. Thank you to the speakers for their insights.